Welcome to the latest revision video on early Elizabethan England, with our focus today on key topic 2, which is challenges to Elizabeth at home and abroad from 1569 to 1588. Today we're looking at part 1, which is plots and revolts at home. The focus of today's content is to look at the reasons for and significance of the rebellion or the revolt of the Northern Earls in 1569 to 1570, the features and significance of the three plots against Elizabeth with regards to Ridolfi, Throckmorton and Babington, Walsingham's use of the spy network, as well as the reasons for and the significance of the execution of Mary Queen of Scots in 1587. First, we're going to be looking at the revolt of the Northern Earls, which began in 1569. The main causes behind this rebellion, first off, was to do with the idea of religious aspects, in that large areas of the north were still Catholic in the 1560s after the religious settlement, and many of them were against these changes. Many of the Northern Earls wanted the return of Catholicism, and the appointment of a Protestant Archbishop of Durham strained matters further, in that he tried to force changes through, and the Catholics in that area didn't like it. There are also political causes to this, particularly with regards to the Northern Earls losing influence within court, and as well as Elizabethan government. So the two key names for this one were the Earls of Westmoreland and the Earl of Northumberland. There's also the issue of Mary Queen of Scots, which we looked at in the last video, but she does crop up again quite a lot in this one. We know already that she had a strong claim to the throne through her lineage back to Henry VII. She was also Catholic, so she was treated as a bit of a figurehead for those that were rebelling, and her being on the throne would restore the influence of Catholics at court. In terms of the failure, the reasons behind it, one of them is to do with the idea of a lack of popular support. So the general public did not support the Earls with regards to this rebellion, purely because of the political aspects and the aspect regarding Mary Queen of Scots. Other aspects were to do with the idea of those that were a little bit wealthier but not necessarily Earls, did not want to put their wealth at risk by being implicated in any rebellion that they might actually fail in. The second is to do with the idea of a lack of foreign support for the rebels. They assumed, the Northern Earls assumed, that France and Spain would get involved as Catholic countries in order to try and launch a counter-reformation within England in the 1560s. However, no support was forthcoming, and therefore they were unable to fulfill their aims of removing Elizabeth from the throne. The third one was to do with the idea of poor planning and leadership, in that the rebel forces were only around about 5,500 in total, and there were no match for the 14,000 Elizabethan troops that were able to be mustered from London and marching up to the north. Of course, the Northern Earl Rebellion failed, but it doesn't mean to say that they didn't have a significance on the reign of Elizabeth. Probably the most important significance is the introduction of the Papal Bull in 1570. This is a documentation from the Pope that released Catholics many loyalty to Elizabeth and called upon them to remove her from the throne. The Northern Earl Rebellion did actually lead to an increase of oppression against Catholics in the north of England, and Mary Queen of Scots was put under house arrest in order to try to reduce her threat towards Elizabeth. There's also the passing of treason laws that made any further Catholic threat punishable by death. Even though these laws were put in place, there were three main plots against Elizabeth in the 1570s and 1580s. The first one is the Ridolfi plot, which happened in 1571, a year after the Papal Bull was introduced. So Ridolfi, who was an Italian banker, took messages from Mary Queen of Scots to Pope Pius V, Philip II, and the Duke of Alva in the Netherlands. And the letters argued for an invasion of England to overthrow Elizabeth and to replace her with Mary Queen of Scots in order to revert England to a Catholic nation. The intelligence network that Elizabeth had created through ministers such as Walsingham became aware and executed the Duke of Norfolk, who was implicated in the plot itself. And this intensified the feeling that Spain was becoming a growing threat towards England in the 1570s. The second main plot is the Throckmorton plot of 1583. And Throckmorton acted as a messenger between Mary Queen of Scots and Catholic noble plotters, along with Spanish and French ambassadors who were running Catholic countries at the time. Again, the aim was to overthrow Elizabeth and to replace her with Mary Queen of Scots to revert to a Catholic nation. And the plan was to invade with a French army with financial backing from Spain and the Pope. The spy network, again introduced by Walsingham, uncovered the plot, and this led to a worsening of relations between England and Spain because of their implication of funding a French army to invade. This therefore led to Parliament introducing the Act of Preservation of the Queen's Safety in 1585. Later on that year, the Babington plot had the same aims as the previous plots, in order to overthrow Elizabeth and replace her with Mary Queen of Scots in order to revert England to a Catholic nation. And Mary Queen of Scots replied to Babington's letter endorsing the plan to kill Elizabeth. The spy network again intercepted this letter and decoded it, and Mary Queen of Scots was directly implicated within this plot. It therefore led to the execution of Mary Queen of Scots, as we'll look at later in this video, and this was significant as it involved the death of a monarch. So we've mentioned quite a lot about the idea of Walsingham and the use of spies, but in case it comes up as a key features question, the spy network sole aim was in order to safeguard the life of the Queen. The Catholic threat, with Mary Queen of Scots as a figurehead to replace Elizabeth with, led to a number of threats and plots that we've looked at before: the Northern Earl Rebellion, Ridolfi, Throckmorton and Babington. And Walsingham was passionate about preventing Catholicism to return to England. Spies were posted abroad who could supply him with intelligence on the politics and attitudes of Catholic countries towards Elizabeth. So there were many spies that were identified within the Netherlands, within France, and within Spain, because they were the key Catholic threats to Elizabeth and England at this point. So as we've already mentioned, there's the execution of Mary Queen of Scots. And so we're looking at this with regards to the causes and the significance, because a question can come up on either of these two. So the key cause, again, as we've mentioned earlier, is that Mary Queen of Scots was implicated in all three plots against Elizabeth. And the introduction of a parliamentary act with regards to the preservation of the Queen's safety meant that evidence gathered by Walsingham spies was enough to ensure the trial and conviction in 1586. Another cause was to do with the idea of Philip II of Spain, and by the start of 1587, rumours were substantiated that he was planning an invasion of England at some point in the near future. So therefore, Mary's existence, simply being alive, continued to pose a significant threat to Elizabeth and to England as a whole. So therefore, the significance of the execution is that it did remove an important threat to Elizabeth. However, this gave Philip II another excuse to remove Elizabeth from the throne, mainly due to the fact that Mary Queen of Scots had given her right to the throne, or had promised her right to the throne upon her death to Philip II. So therefore, if he had invaded and won, then he would have taken the throne of England as per Mary Queen of Scots' wishes. There were, however, lesser significant actions in terms of why was there not actually an uprising to the death of Mary Queen of Scots. We've noticed in previous videos that the Catholics saw Mary Queen of Scots as a figurehead, and yet there was no rebellion against Elizabeth because of the execution. And so English Catholics did remain loyal to Elizabeth despite this. In addition, James VI of Scotland, who was the son of Mary Queen of Scots, decided to take no action against Elizabeth due to the execution. In addition to this, France also wanted to maintain an alliance with Elizabeth because they saw the threat from Spain as a greater significance than the threat from England and Elizabeth. So let's take a look at the idea of answering a 16-mark question. First off, just a recap on the idea of the structure. So a 16-mark question needs to have an introduction, which outlines the idea of your judgment and also any particular criteria that you're able to evaluate against. In terms of the main body of the essay, you need to make sure that you provide 3 separate paragraphs identifying 3 aspects of knowledge. So first of all, you need to point out the factor that you are discussing. You need to provide the evidence to show the examiner what you know about the given factor, and the explanation of how this links to the line of inquiry. So whatever the question is asking of you, you need to make sure that you use the wording of that particular question with the word because at the end in order to identify to the examiner that you are analysing why it leads to that particular event or why it is a threat, depending on what the question is. And then in order to get into band 4, which is 13 to 16 marks, is that you need to identify how strong the factor is to being the most important, the most significant, the biggest reason, depending on what the question is. So the example that could come up within this particular question that hasn't been asked before and is a possible question for the 2022 examinations is political grievances was the main cause of the Northern Earl Rebellion. How far do you agree? In terms of our criteria, the main cause is normally the one that leads directly to the event, so that would go into your introduction. So the reasons that you'd have to discuss would be to do with the idea of political grievances, which we have talked through already. The key piece of evidence there is the influence of court being reduced to the Earls of Westmoreland and Northumberland. You can discuss the religious reasons behind it as well. So the idea of the changes to the religious settlement and changes to Catholicism in England. And you can also discuss about the presence of Mary Queen of Scots in England, her being a Catholic figurehead, and also the presumptive and legitimate heir to the throne of England. In terms of the judgment, you could take any 3 of these to become the main reason or the main cause of the Northern Earl Rebellion. I would suggest looking at political grievances more so, and the reason why it's more important than the religious aspect is that the religious changes had happened 10 years previously, and so therefore why did they not rebel before? The only reason why the Northern Earl Rebellion really happened was because of the loss of influence. They were happy to stomach the religious settlement up until the point that they were no longer able to influence Elizabeth and her decisions at court, and therefore that was the main reason for the rebellion. That concludes this particular episode. The next episode is to do with the idea of the relations on Spain. Please do not forget to like and subscribe.